my absence was really, I think, the cornerstone of my eventual involvement in it.
I saw a documentary shot about him around.
It's called Cracked Actor by Alan Yentob, who is now the head of BBC Two.
And I couldn't think of anybody else for it, actually. The only other person I'd ever thought of in discussing it was Michael Crichton, but only because he was 6'10". I thought that was... And,
is it not true, then, that you really wanted Peter O'Toole?
No, I never thought of Peter O'Toole.
That's the apocryphal story.
Oh,
yeah. Oh, I'm glad I've got that sorted out.
Anyway, I came to New York and heard from various levels of management. Yeah, David will be in New York.
Actually, none of them were very level.
I phoned, and secretary said, "Oh yes, David wants to see you, and come round to the house. He's recording. Come round at 10 o'clock, maybe a bit before. He should be off by 10. So why don't you come round about 9:30, have a drink?" I got at 9:30, and it chatted away to these strangers till 10.
And boy, there were some strangers.
Strangers coming and going, and 10:30 came. There was a call from the studio. It looks like 11. At about 3, I thought, this is a wrap. This is not going to happen. But by that time, I think I'd had a couple of good martinis. I thought, well, if I stay till 3, I might as well stay till 3:30. And at 3:30, the phone went again, and they came back and said, "It looks like it'll be certainly within the next half hour." Maybe by 5 o'clock. He arrived, and we spoke for about 5 minutes. He said, "I'm tired." I said, "I can understand that, so am I." And he said, "Don't worry, I'm going to do it." And just showed me to the door. I was obviously looking a bit stunned from 9:30 till 5:30 in the morning. And he said, "I tell you, don't worry. Let me know when you want me. I'll be there." And I said, "But we're starting in New Mexico." And he said, I'm going to do it." And he showed up. I had no idea the balloon was going to be there. And it broke free of its board and came bouncing down the track towards us, I said, "Don't cut it. I never believe in cutting anything, because it's telling you something,
There we are, the co-star makes an appearance. Well, the first thing he sees, of course, a connection with the human, is the alcohol which is going to destroy him, or at least keep him here. I must say, for an alcoholic, he looks particularly well at the end of the movie. It's your life story, is it, Nick? The only thing I can add to that is that I'd known only the involvement that Nick had had in performance with Jagger before. So I went through the previous films, and I was very, very impressed with Nick's work, overwhelmed, in fact. I thought it was, Walkabout in particular, really struck home. I thought it was a wonderful film. But what I didn't tell him that day when he turned up is that I hadn't actually read Man of Fell to Earth. And it was a combination of having seen Walkabout and actually meeting Nick in person that convinced me that this is something I should definitely get involved with. So I think I conned my way through, giving you the impression that I'd actually...
Maybe he was outside, maybe he was home all the time, but upstairs.
Possibly, yes. Getting with secret cameras, getting a reaction from you, seeing what kind of metal you are. But I remember that Nick talked, this is one of the few things that I remember from 1974, 5? 74, is that Nick was talking... I mean, I tried to kill the conversation as quickly as possible because I didn't want him to suss that I hadn't read it. So he was throwing bits of the film at me, and I was... Yes, quite, absolutely. Oh, yes, I can see that. And so I'm bluffing my way through. But it was probably the best decision based on absolutely nothing other than a man's previous work that I've probably ever made. It's a wonderful experience. I'm very, very proud of that film.
Do you have your ID?
We are all aliens the idea of an alien being having to be from... We haven't finished with the aliens on the Earth yet. I mean, the aliens from outer space are yet to come.
Some marry them.
And he said, I was driving into the valley to the studio, and I pulled over the side of the road, and I thought, I know who Mr. Newton is, it's you. He said that a foreigner stays a foreigner for a long, long time, whether it's a friendly foreigner or whatever.
You drag the luggage of otherness with you.
Yeah, the coming of whole communities to America, which is a wonderful thing. But still, the fight in Europe now between trying to be united, but still alien beings, alien.
As Rip Torn's character suggests at one point, I mean, he asks his very serious question, Mr. Newton, are you Lithuanian? Which I think is one of my favourite lines in the movie. It's a very funny line. For him, that was quite alien enough. Now, maybe he didn't want to face up to the consequences of having to ask the ultimate question, is, are you of our planet? I'm not sure that he felt that was necessary. He just needed to know that.
How foreign are you?
Yes, how foreign are you exactly? My preparation in those days was akin to just putting a hat on, and if it looked right, then that was it. Actually, it hasn't really changed very much at all. I think that probably one of the things that Nic identified with me is that I was definitely living in two separate worlds at the same time. My state of mind was quite fractured and fragmented. But I didn't really have much emotive force going for me, so it was quite easy for me not to relate too well with those around me. The content of the film was almost unimportant. I do remember that. It was Nic's approach to what he was doing, and it seemed to gel very much with what I was in my infancy and in attempting to do in my work. And as I say, it was that kind of, immediate reaction to each other that made me confirm with myself that this is something that I indeed wanted to work with this man. And it's, God, I did as well, didn't I? I'd never known about getting up so early. It's what I want. The way that I read it, for me, in fact, he wasn't godlike at all. In fact, it was, for me, best exemplified by the painting that's used in Bruegel's Icarus Falling, is that, in fact, he was very much a fallible entity. I won't say God and I won't say human, because, he is just a being. He is a being. And it's his endeavours are so destroyed by the beings around him.
It's kind of sad.
The campus computer again. That damn thing doesn't have a mind.
It's not meant to have a mind.
That's what makes it perfect for this place, right?
I remember one day Rip came onto the set in a particularly stompy mood. I loved Rip, I must point out. I thought he was a wonderful guy. Really sort of Hemingway or Mailer or something about him. It was so thoroughly American, East Coast. And he said, he had it in for Nic that day for some reason. He said, "You're going to treat me like a dog, I'm going to react like a dog." Nic looked at him and said, "We won't be shooting Mr. Torn today." Took the camera off and just left him there on the set, fuming. We were all agape every morning, waiting to hear his last night's exploits. He'd come through barbed wire fences and be found in ditches and just I'll tell you what happened last night. Every day and night was a huge adventure for Rip, in a great manly way. He's a great guy.
What are you talking about?
I'm talking about the things you pursue, Nate. Believe you won't.
Artesia is where we went down to. It's an extraordinary place. The weight of the sky is just something indescribable. I mean, it's a magic place. It really is New Mexico. I'd never seen real cowboys, and I mean, these cowboys were nothing like the film cowboys. They were skinheads with tattoos and rings through their noses and ears, and they would dance with their spurs on. We went to a nightclub and our makeup artist came with us. His name was it Justin, or makeup artist? And his wife, Marilyn. So this gorgeous wife that he had. He was sort of a slightly fey young man. And a cowboy came over to us and he said, "How long are you all in town?" And he hid behind me. He said, "Just the week."
It's just as an old village in England in the medieval times, immediately someone comes in, it's suspicious.
Oh, God, now. To go down to Devon, to some of those villages, if you walk through the door, the entire pub stops talking. They all look at you. I mean, even to this day. And even for an Englishman to pick up roots and go and try and live in a village other than the one that he was born in is very difficult. He'll never be regarded as being one of the crowd all of his life.
I think that's a quality of human beings.
Yeah.
Those policemen, they look all modern, but they're quite immediately suspicious.
His musculature is slightly either atrophied or it's affected tremendously by the gravity of the earth. He has walking problems as well.
Disquieting, because it won't be familiar, but how the familiar is different anyways.
Obviously can't keep his food down either. Egg white, wasn't it? Whatever else.
Very enthusiastic prop man.
Oh,
Tommy Rayburn.
That's
enjoyed
right,
all.
Rayburn.
Enjoyed all the foulness and the phlegm.
Any phlegm required today, Governor?
One of these days you ought to try one of these.
I think possibly if I do generate the feeling of Newton successfully, it's because of the deconstruction that Nic was able to perform on the basic material that I brought to the role. I was quite plastic in that way, you know. It was virtually easy for Nic to guide me into any area that he wanted to, like the good alchemist that he is. And I think there's a shadow of the life that I was living there, but it was merely a shadow. But I guess in reality, the reality is on the screen. The shadow was in the real life. If that makes any sense to you, I don't know.
Yeah, but it sounds rather like Verlaine, who said, "I write stories and then let them happen to me."
Yes, absolutely. The planned accidents of life. I couldn't agree more.
Sure.
Lead such interesting lives. People who travel. People who write stories.
The thing that fascinates me about Nic's films, all of Nic's films, is the way that buildings always look like some meddling by human beings. They look like an intrusion. From the city shot in Walkabout to this, the city shots in this, something that man has sort of contrived to, these nonsensical things that man has created.
Hello, Tommy.
I remember that I came to the set the first time with between 300 and 400 books, because I didn't have a permanent place, because I was on the road such a lot. I used to take my entire library with me. And I remember sitting in a very stone state in the living room in the hotel, and Nic and Candy came in to talk with me. And I was rushing from one book to another, from the complete works of Francis Bacon, with a section on, I think it was New Atlantis, the description of the recording studio, to some tome on Israel Regardie or something like that. And I just reading paragraph after, and Nic said at the end, he said, "Your trouble is, David, you don't read enough." I was so insulted. I didn't know it was a joke. That pretty much shows where I was at. I had absolutely no idea that he was taking the rise. Somebody has pointed it out later.
It's a joke.
It's a joke, David. What did he mean I don't read enough? Look, I've got 300 books. Some of them first editions. Right, and it was coincidentally, I can't say it was in any way preparation. I was reading Listen Little Man at the time. Well, it must have had some bearing on trying to tell the world of some imminent danger and not succeeding. And that's pretty much also part of Newton's agenda.
We've handed song sheets out today of an old English him.
I presumed, I don't know why, probably because I was arrogant enough to think it so, therefore I acted upon it, that I had been asked to write the music for this film. And I spent 2 or 3 months putting bits and pieces of material together. I had no idea that nobody had asked me to write the music for this film. In fact, it had been an idea that was bandied about. And I constructed a thing which in the death never became the soundtrack to the movie, but became the album Low. Some of it went on to Station to Station, but another chunk of it went on to Low, which was the album that I did with Brian Eno in Berlin a few years later.
I'm rather glad that happened. Actually.
So am I. Well, as it happens, the Low album then was performed on Friday and Saturday night this weekend by Philip Glass. It was turned into a symphony. So I think The Visitor, it would have been The Visitor. And I think that's quite lovely that this should be coming out again in its original form, alongside Low, which has been sort of dusted off and released again.
When Low came out, I was really quite thrilled that it came out, only David could know that, but prompted somehow by the film or the experience. But I remember, as David said, he worked on it, we had a time thing, and so that was not abandoned, but it was nothing formal, and it drifted away, and I think he became involved in another concert tour, and it drifted away, but
yeah,
it went away.
Yeah, it went away. Leave me alone, leave my mind alone.
I was rather glad that because it gave it another connection and somehow continued on.
Yeah, there have been links all the way through.
So I had to move on. We moved on, and I'd known John Phillips, and I showed him the stuff, and he loved it, and he knew David, and it was all right with David. But some time later, David sent me the album of Low. He said this was the music I think I would have done for Man Who Fell to Earth. In fact, he used a still from Man Who Fell to Earth on the cover of the album, you know. It's an extraordinary album, Low. It's wonderful stuff. You know, she talks about like going on trains in Oklahoma with her granny, and the train that he left on.
Bloody train. I remember, Nick, when the train come, it was nothing like the thing that he'd envisaged. Am I correct in this? And when that train rolled up in the middle of the desert, he went blue in the face, then he went red and then white. What is that? It's your train, sir. That's not a train, it's a fucking dog kennel. But we live with it, and as it happens, it has an endearing quality to it, the train, that it's so sweet to look at that, and then the freight train that I see from the window.
Concession stands were gone.
And there's our train. I think Candy's, one of Candy's best little monologues is her monologue in the car, waiting for the train to go past. I love that scene.
It's a shame. I used to like trains.
Is this music Farnsworth keeps sending me? I don't like it.
Some German composer.
I think a pertinent point is that his choice of music is Roy Orbison. I thought that was so lovely because of all the rock stars, Roy seemed like the alien. He really wasn't quite the same as anybody else, from his strangely shaped head to his glasses, and everything about him pointed to him being the outsider. I love the use of Orbison in this. Orb, of course.
Don't turn on those damn TVs. Come on, Tommy. Talk to me.
The gynecological aspects of this scene always intrigue me. It's one of my favourite. The still that was taken from this I thought was fabulous. The gynecological chair.
In the stirrups.
Yes, and the slightly mummy-looking character that I... Sort of Mummy Unleashed. Mummy with his head wrapped off. So Mummy in a gynecologist chair made perfect sense to me. The fact that he could, in fact, hear all those TVs and take in all that information.
Yeah, but the curious thing is that now, this was pre the telecommander and the clicking through the stations. You know, so now, I mean, my kids watch 4 and 5 programs at a time through the commercials. They just, that's the damnation for the 4 networks, isn't it? It was the telecommander. And they have on every television set, you can put in the centre of what you're watching and have a look at what's on the other stations.
Just have
and
all 18
put
screens
one
on at once.
Why not?
The fact that he's picking up all the human needs, it seems to him, and sort of being introduced to the ideas of violence, the superficial elements of sex and love, and that lovely betrayal shot, of course.
Billy Budd.
Yes, Billy Budd. The extraordinary Terence Stamp. Absolutely incredible. But these obsessive images of violence and destruction and being connected eventually with the sexual act, which really, I mean, I presume you agree, but these are probably some of the most hostile and violent sexual scenes that one can think of in a movie. The bodies in the sex scenes are almost slug-like as well, in the way they're shot and the lighting that's used. Quite repellent. It was a right prophetic little number in terms of the hardware and stuff. The film possibly preempted some of the things that came after it, with its holograms and its instantaneous printing cameras and the spherical ball that plays music and whatever, the kind of the way it was dressed, I guess. You see, at another level, for me, the film remains a story of betrayal rather than anything else that has the dressing of science fiction. For me, it has that spiritual thing, the Christ story and whatever has elements of that in it. The moment that Newton realizes the cameras have taken his pictures, for me, is a religious moment. It harks back for me to the Bible story of Jesus knowing that he's going to be betrayed, and Newton knows he's going to be betrayed. It's quite obvious. But he seemingly doesn't do much about it. So there must be some other reason for his being here.
He had to hide himself, you know. So it was not super technology. It was just a little before its time, and to be able to be disguised as software, you know.
For a cosmic yuppie.
That way, I don't think that the hardware got in front. I hoped it didn't get in front of the movie. I mean, maybe Blade Runner is a good example. Looking back now at it, I mean, the hardware was so fantastic in it. They got in front of the intentions. You see it happening, don't you? In morphing now. There's Michael Jackson face changes in his video. Now you see on every commercial. It's hardware is very quickly accepted. It's over. You know,
and has very little to say in itself at all. I mean, it's just used cosmetically like that. But I think that the one thing possibly, and sorry to go back to one of my things, because it's not the intention of this interview at all, but to pick up on that point, I don't think he would have had such sustaining power if it was just a question of pushing forward the cosmetic, and I used that pun lightly, aspects of Ziggy. I think there was something more inherently disquieting about him, from his sexuality to his isolationist positioning, to the fact that he possibly had a deviant kind of plan in his mind that is not the accepted norm with rock singers. So I think, you know, the hardware, it's reduced down to such a sort of a cheap currency these days. I'm not at all impressed with hardware. Or anyway, the way that it's used, the way that it's presented to us, it's cheap, very cheap. The frightening thing is that the acceleration of technology and our capabilities for inventing it is so vast, and it's accelerated to such a point that we are now totally incapable of understanding that which we've created. We really have created a monster. Do you think we'll eventually evolve into creatures who think and talk ably in fragmentation, which is the only way to go if we're to make any kind of use of this kind of...
I think probably so.
Plethora of information that we have, because there's far too much now for any of us to really absorb, and we're just increasing it daily. It's a no-win situation, so we have to evolve to that kind of being to be able to cope with the things that we've invented, because they're raced far ahead of us. Our things know much more than we do.
Yeah, in specifics, but we know far more of a pattern, as you said. It'll be speaking in telegrams. I think people will speak in...
Well, we are. Look at the things that, the way we watch commercials.
Soundbite.
Yeah, soundbite. What I miss is sort of the in-depth implications of the things that we say, that sometimes conversations are reduced to sound bites, I find, which is terribly annoying. You might cover more ground, but you don't cover it as thoroughly at all.
Well, I talked with Farnsworth.
But the reflecting on music, I mean, there's obviously a need to get away from hardware, because I think the most vital and dynamic music at the moment is made on very low-tech machinery. And there's even a thing of trying to dirty up tracks coming from urban music and from rappers and such. There's a feeling of ignoring the high-tech thing altogether, to get away from it, to sort of avoid it. And I guess in the arts, a return to figurative painting, to get away from the conceptualism of neon light bulbs lying against a wall and all that. There's a big return to needing that tactile, organic feel again.
You don't know anything about anybody. Yes, you know certain bits that you've found out or that inevitably have been revealed. And the promises, it's about secrecy and lovers' promises of tell me, I won't care, did you fuck her? Did you? It won't matter to me, I just must know. All right, I did. Oh my God! It's quite human, although alien, but the alien as the human. And he said, all right, if you must know, how do you like this? It's not dissimilar from the reaction that would be just on a simple confession to an affair. You want to know who I am? I'll tell you.
The lovely irony of this is that she walks into the scene dressed as a Japanese girl, and with her "I'll show you what I am" takes her Japanese wig off. "If you'll show me what you are." So he does.
You won't find anyone who'd do for you like I've done for you.
Such a lovely shot, this. I've seen this shot borrowed so many times since this film. Just added to the general vocabulary of filmmaking, that shot. In those days, contacts tended to be the hard contacts, these great, huge plastic things that really hurt the eye. They really, really hurt very badly. And I had two sets. I had the hard ones that went in that were the cat's eyes, and then on top of those I had the little rubberized ones that went in. But the cat's ones gave me a lot of problems, because I was particularly dehydrated at that stage, and the desert didn't help. I just never seemed to be
It's
lubricated. Oh, it was all
because they fit right over the eyeball.
Yeah. Terribly naughty, Nick. I always thought it was a shame that she was so repulsed by him, because I thought he actually cut a very attractive figure as an alien. Probably a lot more attractive than Newton himself in his human guise. I think it was probably the squishy bits she didn't like. There's our watcher, our observer. So at a rational level, one presumes that indeed the establishment have already had pre-knowledge that that capsule was going to land. They've been tracking it. But at a spiritual level, it rides along perfectly with Nic's maxim that you're always being watched, whatever you do. Yet again, Nic, someone is always watching you, Nic once said to me. David, whatever you do, don't forget, however alone you think you are, someone is always watching you. And unlike the "you don't read enough" line, I thought he was joking. But that's the way of the world. There are all kinds of aspects of the film that I find quite contemporary. The alcohol being one of the major stars of the movie, the degradation and destruction that it can bring to so many relationships is made very clear if you want to read it that way. That could be quite a point of the 90s, I think.
Me? The two of us?
I think that its basic concept of the destructive forces that we exert on ourselves and each other, the humiliation and violence and revengefulness that we bring to our relationships, is probably more understood now than it ever was in the 70s. And I think it pinpoints it far ahead of its time. I don't think that it is intrinsically a 70s movie. I find it gains strength and passion through the years.
Won't they come in the noise?
By our standards today, what was considered censorable then is absolutely lukewarm by today's standards.
Well, something else is more sensible. You know, I mean, we see changes, don't we? And Uncle Tom's Cabin is censored, and sex isn't. You know, violence isn't, and so I mean, it's bizarre. You know, history is censored and rewritten. I mean, everything is. That's a confusion of censorship, isn't it? Censorship is very bizarre. It's only about control, crowd control. You know, that's all. It has nothing to do with morality. It's about crowd control, governmental crowd control, or you know, whatever the group it is.
However, the cyclic factor in this is that the great hostility and overwhelming dynamic feelings that are brought to the surface in their love scene, Newton and Mary Lou's, run parallel with the emphasis on violent sexual encounters in the last couple of years on screen. So, yet again, it's bang up to date in that particular area. The blue light, that's the one thing that it's the slug-like look of everything under that blue light that I found. I find that very disturbing.
Yes.
You don't want to go back?
Nic did take our basic personas and manipulate them to suit the needs of the story that he was to tell. Quite rightly. I'm very wary of people presuming that if they know enough about your life that it'll explain your art. I think that's not a sound foundation for judging an artist's work at all, because you're not expressing a private thing that is revealed. I don't think it's very interesting half of the time. I tend to find always that the work of the artist generally is much more interesting than the artists themselves, because they release these unknown sides of themselves. The artist very rarely knows what it is he's actually doing when he's creating something, and he often reveals depths of his unconscious that he had no idea he was revealing, and taps into aspects of himself that hitherto he'd not touched before. That's very apparent in Nic's work, and I think it's quite apparent in some of mine, that you get into corners that you've never been in before, corners of the soul more than the mind. You think you're working from the mind some of the time, but actually you're working from the soul.
Probably go back.
I always have great feelings of inadequacy when it comes to explaining any kind of art anyway. I always totally feel tongue-tied and inarticulate, because you know you're only touching on, most of the time, the superficialities of it, or the outside skin, so to speak. Someone like Eno holds to a completely different theory, that if an artist can't explain his work, then his work's invalid. But that's a very postmodernist sort of thing, you know. And I'm not sure if I buy that at all. But he's more concerned with concept than he is with sort of the thing that touches you spiritually. And although he denied that, but it's true. I'd already sort of been really tantalised by the idea of fragmentation, because I was quite a William Burroughs fan, you know, through the early 70s. That in combination with Nic's realisation generally that certain things had collided in such a way that presented a third piece of information which none of us were aware of. And it would delight him when he saw these coincidences make sense, this order coming out of chaos, which of course has now become, again, in the 90s, the order in chaos is a substantial theory and science, which was never thought or never sort of conceived in the 70s. And that element, I think, I took away. I invested that in a lot of my work throughout the rest of the 70s. And sort of, I guess, it reached its own particular zenith it had with the work with Eno. My work was certainly informed by the coincidence and fragmentation process of working in this film with Nic. Very definitely. The act and fact of coincidence. And I changed my hairstyle.
Producer before said, I don't know how this film ever got made. I said, what do you mean? He said, when he saw it, he said, there is no reason why any company should have ever made this film. There is absolutely no reason. As a producer and as an executive, he said, I don't know how it got made. And the producers at the time, I think they weren't looking at the subject. They weren't looking at the people involved. They were looking at, oh, that's a movie with David Bowie. They looked at record sales and they looked at everything except, probably as David, except the script. They looked at everything, which was very lucky.
I think the script
which was very
was the
lucky.
casualty of this movie.
Which was very lucky that...
I'm so sad when I look back at these things sometimes. I wonder where all the bric-a-brac went. The rings and the passports and the personal items. And I had a very close friend, a girlfriend in Berlin when I was living there, who unfortunately was dying of cancer. And she underwent chemotherapy treatment and went bald. And I gave her the fedora. I'd kept that fedora all those years, and I gave her the fedora. She wore that until the day she died. Poor girl. But it had a good home for its last few months. So I know where that went.